Hey everyone, John Kennedy here, and today I am with Michael Scott, our CFA, in-house CFA. Michael, say hello.
How's everyone doing today? You made me laugh now, dude.
So we're excited. We're going to be talking about these are common questions we're getting a lot right now. Michael recently did a 5-minute video that we sent out to all of you, our clients, about just Q1 recap, what we can expect in the rest of the year going forward, both in the markets and the economy. And it brought about a lot of, I felt like different and good conversation throughout our client meetings. And I'm finding that I'm getting a lot of these same questions. So today we just kind of wanted to do a panel with the two of us, and I'm going to do some Q&A, and we're going to ask Michael these questions. Michael, are you ready? These are some hot burning questions.
Absolutely. Let's do it, man.
All right, cool. Let's do it. So the first question that we have for you, Michael, is I'd like for you, if you could just describe, I think we conventionally all know what inflation is. Like, we've heard that term so many times already into 2022. But your words, I'd like to hear you describe what inflation is and how does government spending impact inflation as well?
Yeah, John. So two great questions. And one of the things that we're going to continue hearing is the story of inflation, probably this year and probably into next year. But simply put, inflation is just the rising cost of goods and services in the economy. It's how much more you pay for something than you did a month ago, a year ago, a time period before. And one of the questions that's really coming up a lot, and people are asking a lot, is, over the past 2 years, with everything that happened with COVID, we put a lot of money into the system. The government put all these different things in place, like stimulus checks, the payroll protection program, and multiple other different programs. And a lot of people say, hey, we just spent a ton of money. We just printed a ton of money. That's where all this inflation is coming from, or is that where all this inflation is coming from? And the answer is kind of, but that's not the only thing that's going on. So one of the explanations that we like to use when talking about inflation is just boiling it down to the economy. So let's say the economy every year produces 10 apples, and that's what the output is. And before the pandemic and everything's going on, the economy, let's say, simple numbers, is worth $10. Okay, so every apple of output is worth $1. 10 divided by 10 is 1. And then COVID hits and things shut down, and we put all these programs in place, and then suddenly we print all this money. And depending on where you look and what numbers you get, because some of this is a little fuzzy accounting, we printed something like $4 trillion worth of stimulus. So let's say it was $4 trillion, but to our economy, let's say it's $4 gets added. So now the actual dollars in the economy goes up to 14. But in theory, our economy is only producing 10 apples. So instead of that same apple costing $1, now it costs $1.40. Mm-hmm. And if everything happened in a vacuum, and that was the only thing that occurred, that would be true, and we'd call that inflation, because we printed so much money that the money becomes less valuable for the same amount of output. So that's the first piece of it, but that's not exactly the entirety of the problem, because one of the key things that gets ignored in that analogy is that we assume that the economy doesn't grow at all. And one of the things that we know coming out of 2020 is the economy began growing again. It's growing faster than it was before, and it's larger than it was pre-pandemic. So now the economy is actually producing, let's say maybe it's producing 12 apples instead of 10 apples every year. Maybe it's more, maybe it's less. But now, instead of your apple being just worth $1.40, maybe it's worth $1.20, $1.10, $1.15, somewhere around there. And then we factor in, what's going on with the supply chain. So here in the US, most of our cities are open. The biggest thing we contend with in COVID is the masks. And when we look at that to compare to other countries like China, China has a zero COVID policy, meaning if they find COVID, they lock down a city, and they've recently done that with Shanghai, and that causes problems in the supply chain. And everyone's probably heard that many times this year as well. And what that means is that there's a scarcity of goods, and we're all demanding the same amount of goods, if not more, So the price of all the goods go up because they're more scarce. There's not as many, so that pushes inflation a little bit up. But then you talk about housing and that entire situation. Back in '08, we built all these homes, and then
Yeah.
we had a glut of homes.
Yeah.
Homes lost value. So home builders were more responsible in the past 10 years, 10, 15 years. They build less, which
Yeah.
leads to another issue. So the actual piece of inflation is a lot more complicated than just the government spending money. There's a lot of different things that go into it. And part of that becomes how much of it is transitory and how much of it is going to be sticky moving forward. And that's going to be the great question, actually, moving forward throughout the year.
So you said a buzzword, which is supply chain. That's like everyone's talking about that. I think another one is interest rates. We're hearing so much about interest rates, Jerome Powell, and what's going to happen, and are we going to raise rates, and if so, by how much, and how many rate hikes? I get this question a lot, but I'm a little more curious as it relates back to inflation. What does raising interest rates do to help reduce inflation? How does that actually work?
Yeah. So, first of all, going back into 2020, the Fed dropped interest rates down to zero. And they did that to make things cheaper in aggregate. So you think about going to buy a home, your interest rate that you get on your home, before the pandemic may have been close to 5%. You build a new home during the pandemic, maybe your interest rate is 3% because the Federal Reserve drops rates. So then moving into this year, the Federal Reserve began raising interest rates. So, a lot of people have refinanced their mortgage over the past 2 years, and they're getting all these great rates below 3% for 30-year mortgages, or even lower on 10s and 20-year mortgages. Now, as the Federal Reserve begins to hike interest rates, it makes those mortgages get more expensive. So instead of being a 3% mortgage, it's suddenly 3.5%. And to most buyers in the US economy, a small move like that isn't going to be a big deal. But what happens if you're someone who wants to buy a house and you're paying 5% is what you were quoted to start the year? And now suddenly your credit profile isn't that great. So your interest rate jumps from 5 to 6. Suddenly you have to think about, do I really want to buy this home? Can I really afford it? And on the margins or on the outside, we begin to see economic activity slow down. So we think about when the Federal Reserve is doing, is they're tapping the brakes a little bit on the economy and trying to slow it down. They're trying to make consumers and businesses alike really consider how they want to spend their money, spend it in the most smart ways to keep things from getting out of hand or getting too hot. It's keep things from people buying two homes or businesses investing all over the place. We want to be a little bit more smart about the money at this point.
And when we talk about interest rates, so that was that Fed funds rate that they set at zero, and that they're now discussing increasing, and a lot, or I guess really in theory, everything is sort of tied back to that. I mean, because we could be talking about auto loans, home loans, business loans, right? Pretty much across the board. Now, I get that it's maybe not like a one-to-one correlation to it, but it kind of all starts there and is somehow tied to that, right?
Yep. So essentially, most loans, whether you go to a bank and whether you're, like you said, buying a home, buying a car, anything that you would finance, credit cards, anything that you're using financing for is going to be tied to the interest rate somehow. And the Federal Reserve mainly controls the federal funds rate. That's the very, very short-term rate. And by changing that, they make things a little bit more expensive. And what they try and do then is just to reduce demand in the economy to keep prices from rising at a rapid pace. So really we could see, we mentioned homes a lot, but the same thing happens with autos. Same thing can happen with different spending. People may not want to carry such large credit card balances anymore. And we see just on the edges, the economy slows a little bit, which is a healthy thing. We don't want it sprinting the entire time.
How does all of this impact investors' decisions today as it relates to, cash, bonds, stocks that they might have in their portfolio? And I think maybe more specifically, or to rephrase that question, recognizing that when rates were low, and even historically right now they still are, but with rates being low, that's benefited the consumer to go out and borrow. But the average retiree, that's hurt them in a lot of ways over the last 10 years, thinking like having a conventional 50-50 portfolio or 60-40 portfolio, that fixed income side is not yielding what it once was 15, 20 years ago. And so in theory, it's almost like as rates go up or when rates are higher, that could be a good thing for an income portfolio, for the fixed income side of the portfolio. But there's a pain in getting to that point because of how that impacts bond prices. So I guess I'm curious, like, and you don't have to go way deep on this question, but just like, what's your sentiment on how that impacts investors' decisions today?
Yeah, John, it's actually kind of a double-edged sword in some ways. You kind of hit on it. There's winners and losers in everything. And the key thing to remind ourselves in is if the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates, it's generally a positive thing for the economy. It means the economy is strong. It means the economy can handle higher interest rates and should have higher interest rates. Mm-hmm. Now, specifically talking about stocks, bonds, and cash, because those are probably the three biggest buckets for most investors and how they think about things. Interest rates going up, as they move up, that kind of hurts bonds. So if you think about, you have a bond today that pays you 1%, and then next year you can get a bond that's worth 2%. Do you want to have a bond that pays 1, or do you want to have a bond that pays 2? Most people would rather have 2, which is why the bond that pays 1% drops in value. So that kind of thing on the way up can be a little painful because bonds may lose value. But also we remember that bonds are in your portfolios for protection. We want that ballast. We're okay losing a little bit for the safety. That flips to the other side is, you want to look at stocks. Why do we own stocks? Because generally speaking, when the economy is doing good, companies do well, and that grows your wealth over a period of time. And we're kind of in a really interesting situation here where we have high inflation. We have interest rates going up. So what do you do if you want to invest? If you keep money in cash, you lose to inflation. So, inflation last year was high compared to historical standards. So let's say it was 5% last year, you lose 5% of your purchasing power if you just kept everything in cash. So that doesn't sound great. Mm-hmm. You put money in bonds, you get your coupons coming back, but you may lose a little bit in principal value. Like that doesn't feel good either. So then we look at stocks, and stocks are one of the places that the economy is going well. They can keep pace with inflation and they can deal with higher interest rates because businesses have money. So one of the things we want to think about is still having a good amount of exposure to stocks and keeping enough bonds and cash on hand to meet a couple of years worth of needs. And outside of that, you just take the money and put it in stocks and let it ride and just see what happens.
Yeah, right. One final question, because I'm just curious what your opinion is of the impact between now and the rest of the year. And as we're recording this, it's early April. So COVID, coronavirus, what are your thoughts on, is there a continued impact? Obviously we saw what happened in 2020 and thereafter. Do you feel like that will continue to affect the economy and or the markets?
COVID should, and I'm going to say this with a should, be in the back burner or be in the back mirror for most investors or even just most Americans at this point. Most Americans have either been vaccinated or been infected with the virus, or sometimes both. And for the most part, we're seeing numbers drop in the US, and it's becoming less of an issue. What it's going to mean for investors in the US really has more to do with the outside world, and more specifically dealing with China. China's zero policy, if they close down, that's going to push supply kinks into the system, and we'll have to work our way through that. But really, and realistically speaking, COVID, barring some new strain that is highly transmissible and highly severe, should not play a major role for most investors or Americans at this point.
Got it. Yeah, great to know. What else is on your landscape? Like, just as we wrap up this Q&A panel, what else is on your landscape between now and the end of the year? Just something to be mindful of, from a planning or portfolio point of view.
Yeah, the one thing that I think most people need to think about moving forward, it's not a great topic to talk about at some point, is politics. And I'm not saying specifically one party versus the other, because there's right and wrong on both sides here. But we have to remember this is an election year. We're going to have an election in November, and there's going to be hot topics. You have inflation going up, you have interest rates going up. There's going to be a lot of headlines from both sides, and everyone's going to try and politicize this for their own gain. That means that there's going to be volatility in the market. At some point, we're going to see the market go down and probably back up and probably back down again, and probably back up again before the election occurs. Yeah. So really understanding that a lot of this is rhetoric directed towards an election, not necessarily rooted in policy, is something that most investors need to be aware of and realize that probably could happen moving forward.
It's so fascinating to me. I sort of joke, but it's not really a joke. There's truth to it. I tell clients all the time, the face of like what's causing the volatility will change and evolve over time. There's always something new. But it does seem like volatility is never really behind us. It's one of those, like, in the rear view mirror where we might look back and go, oh gosh, yeah, it wasn't that volatile of a year. Things were kind of smooth. But in the moment, it does presently always feel like we're experiencing volatility. I mean, leading up to now, this just the first 3 to 3.5 months of this year, where it started with inflation and interest rates, the crisis in Ukraine with Russia, an election year later this year. There's always something to create volatility, I find, and it's easy as an investor to get nervous and get worried about this type of stuff if you allowed yourself to, because if it bleeds, it leads in the news, right? They're never reporting positive stuff usually. So I think it's easy to get overwhelmed with it, but I think, obviously being a seasoned investor and being able to be calm and rational and with your decisions and choices during that time is pretty important too. So it's crazy.
It's important to remember that everything that's going on in the moment, all the news headlines are exactly that. They're in the moment.
Yeah.
And for most investors, you have a 20+ year time horizon, whether you're accumulating assets or you're living in retirement. You may be living in retirement for 20 to 30 years, depending on what part you're in. So it's not simply what's going on today, but 5, 10, 15, 20 years out, and taking a longer term focus at that.
Yeah, that's so true. Because that's something we educate and talk with clients on all the time. Is, I think, in the United States, where the way that we view retirement, we're kind of conditioned to believe like, okay, great, as we approach that age, 60, 65, whatever, as we approach that age, we need to get more conservative, which is, conventionally good. There's truth to that. But it's not like that's like that date is the end game. If anything, that's the start of it. At 60, 65, now we've got 30+ years, depending on longevity and genetics of your situation. We've got 30+ years that we, need to continue to manage and make sure we're, there's growth, but also protection in the portfolio. So it's a fascinating conversation. And I just think it's so easy to get wrapped up or worried about what's going on in the news. And that's why we do this type of stuff and have these conversations, because Absolutely. Michael knows much, much more about portfolio and investments than we do. And that's why he is a part of the team. So thank you, Michael. Appreciate you coming on with us.
Thanks, John. Appreciate being here.
Yeah, absolutely. So if anybody has any questions, obviously feel free to reach out to us. Michael can be reached at michael@canterpath.com. And this is the stuff that we love doing. We love talking about markets. We love talking about volatility, financial planning, retirement planning, you name it. And so, financial planning in general can be it can cast a wide net and cover a lot of different areas. And so, we love collaborating as a team, so that we can really feel confident in our expertise in every one of those areas. So, if it's Matt, myself, or Michael, if you have questions for us, feel free to reach out. Thanks.
See ya.